here. She's from Sense 360. She's going to talk to us about customers' lifetime value. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. Hi, everybody. Are you ready? Are you ready for some good information? Nice.
We are.
Oh, well, wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I am super excited to be speaking with you about this tricky metric, such as customer lifetime value. Lifetime value is a double-edged sword. You define it correctly, and it cuts through the noise. You make a mistake, and instead it's going to cut into your profits. In this short but informative talk, you will learn about the caveats and assumptions that come with this metric, along with some seasoned frameworks and fresh perspective that will hopefully equip you to avoid them, or at least deal with them. So let us begin. But first, let me introduce myself and the team that I'm part of. And I'm assuming I need to use a laptop for that. It's not working. So I just, yeah, I mean, you know, MacBooks. I'm a Windows girl. Go 90s. So, okay. So my name is Tatiana. I'm part of a stellar team of data scientists and engineers here at Sense 360, a startup that was acquired by Medallia a couple years back. We built and continue to develop the leading next generation consumer insights platform that relies on a panel of over 5 million active users. We transform and aggregate information that comes from a combination of business visits, transactions data, and feedback data pipelines. As a result, we offer an actionable insights platforms that lets leading restaurants, retailers, and other B2C brands understand and act on consumer behavior before, during, and after their interaction with the brand. So it's like web analytics for the physical world. And as our customers ask questions such as, how do we retain the most loyal customers, and how can we think about acquiring them? We ask ourselves the same type of questions, but we don't have the luxury of using such a robust platform like Sense 360 to guide us in that. So what do? We dive deep into the weeds of industry standard financial and business KPIs. And there's one metric that helps you understand your existing consumer behavior more than others. And you can guess what it is. So on our agenda, okay, we'll talk about what this metric is and why we need it. What are the main components of customer lifetime value? We'll speak about the common pitfalls that you face when calculating it, and we'll cover some practical methodologies that will help you deal with those issues. There'll be a little bit of Python. There'll be some statistics involved, so stay strong. But before we get to the juicy stuff, let's make sure that we are on the same page. And in really simplistic terms, customer lifetime value is a metric that allows you to measure, or I guess rather estimate, the overall profit that you're expecting to gain from your average customer throughout the entire business relationship with them. And so for customer, we want to see the entire purchase history, not just one order, but the entire collection of purchases. For lifetime, it's not just profit to date, but it's also projecting and forecasting ahead into the future. And for value, it's pretty self-explanatory, but we'll see some layers that it entails. Okay, so but the question is, why do we need it? What's so special about it? How we can use it in our day-to-day? Just like applied math, lifetime value is only a number until we apply it to your decision-making process. Its main goal is to showcase the maximum amount you can spend on your customer acquisition without it negatively affecting your bottom line. And I just want to say that as a startup, you can be hitting a short but very aggressive sprint at the expense of your profits. So in that case, maybe lifetime value should wait. But let's say you are interested in growing and remain profitable. then you can use this metric as your reference point to measure against and ask questions such as, well, how much should I spend on customer acquisition? Who are my best customers in terms of revenue and loyalty? And which of the all-time best customers are more likely to churn? And these are just some of the questions that you can answer, and segmenting it into different, or I guess analyzing your customer base separated into different cohorts can lead you to strategic improvements across different business layers. It can be products. So for example, you can see, well, the customers who interact most with this feature after I made X changes, how does it change? Or your pricing strategy. Let's say you move a portion of your customers to different pricing tier. How does that affect my customer lifetime value for that specific customer cohort, right? Or churn. Let's say you have your retention team and they're focused on retaining that specific market segment that's performing worse in terms of their lifetime value. It's like, is it worth it to keep that team engaged, working against the churn tide? So it's very interesting, especially when you have a goal on how to apply it and not just use it because it's something that's just, that you heard about. Then the next natural question you may ask is like, how's it calculated? Well, it depends. There's no consistent, specific formula that solves for it all. The method varies from vastly oversimplified formulas that you probably have seen on the internet to loaded methods that account for like all of the variable costs that enter the customer domain. Here you can see just a traditional, or at least it's called traditional formula that you may see on the internet. It's slightly more sophisticated than your average formula that again is popularized across the web. And it's pretty straightforward if you think of it. I'm just going to quickly go into the main components. You have the net sales per month, and that is basically it includes discounts, right? It accounts for the return merchandise, and it's pretty obvious. Like this is my net sales per month. Then I have the average customer lifespan or tenure or your contract age, like whatever you call it. Then you have the margin, right? Revenue less cost of goods sold or cost of service, and divided right by revenue. You may ask, well, do I use net or gross margin? And interestingly, the recommendation is typically to go for gross because it keeps it clean. And if you think of it, if you deduct whatever expenses are deducted when you calculate the net, like operational expenses or your interest charges, right? They're not necessarily related to your customer behavior or their purchasing history. So that's why the recommendation is typically to use your gross margin. Discount rate is just a rate, an interest rate that you use to discount your future cash flow to get cash flows to get the net present value. It ranges from like 8 to 15-ish, and it depends on some factors like your cost of capital or your market conditions. If there's like a lot of ambiguity, you want to like increase that rate so that it accounts for that ambiguity. And like you should probably ask your financial advisor or CFO who would probably know best, hopefully know best, right? And then the retention rate, or the proportion of your customers who retain with you month over month. So pretty straightforward. You get to your average profit margin per customer lifespan, right? The left portion of the formula right there. And then you get to $180, and then you do the rest of the calculations, adding up to $450. And like, okay, so there's $450, but how do I think about that number and what do I do with it, right? And the most common thing to do, besides like staring at it, is to compare it to customer acquisition costs, okay? And when you compare it to customer acquisition costs, how do you, again, think about the ratio? For a subscription business model, the typical ratio is like 3 to 1, meaning in our example is like 450. So you wouldn't want to spend more than 33% or ideally 25% on acquiring new customers. And in our case, it'll be like ranging $110, $150. And what else am I missing? Oh, well, that's pretty much it for this slide. Some questions may arise when looking at it, like, can I use revenue instead of profit? What actually constitutes as a lifespan? I know you just said it's self-explanatory, but is it really? And then what if I'm not a subscription business? What am I, retailer? Like, what do I do then? right? And by the end of this talk, you'll have the answers. Let's start with the first question, such as revenue versus profit when calculating the customer lifetime value. And it's one of the most common pitfalls that I also actually I experienced. So I want to caution you against it. Even if you opt for the most basic method of calculation, like you see here, like it cannot really get simpler. You do want to account for the margin. The common misconception here is that your customer acquisition cost, or CAC, which sounds really, really weird, but this is what it is. When you compare it to CAC, you want to be mindful that it does not account for other costs. You do need to use margin. It only covers your marketing or sales expenses that you use in order to acquire a customer. But what if your cost of service? What of your third-party software integrations that you paid for in order to deliver the service? Or your AWS cloud instances? What about them? And as you can see from the graph, the difference, it can be very drastic, and the metric itself can be detrimental and very misleading. So this is something, again, to be mindful of when thinking about the value component of the metric. Let's see. Then I'm going to be your Captain Obvious, and I'm going to say that you want to make sure that you get your base inputs correct, because otherwise, garbage in, garbage out. And you can definitely calculate this metric for your entire customer base, but the results won't be as accurate as they would have been if you separated it into customer cohorts, right? Especially if you have a smaller, or I guess like this, the smaller the data pool of data, the greater the variance, and the less accurate the result, the less helpful the average. And segmentation comes to rescue. And you can ask, okay, but how do I segment? How do I think about it? Again, some recommendations that I've seen so far that I think work really well is use your customer behavior. Use your customer behavior first and leave demographics, purchase categories, and other covariates for later. Then another common pitfalls here is overstating your lifespan, right? The second component, overstating your lifespan, whatever you call it. As a startup, especially, you may have a very, very small pool of data. And let's say you want to remain profitable, but you don't have enough data. So what do you do? Well, you can either roughly estimate, or you can, I guess, tap into third-party data, right? Third-party data that maybe originates in the same market space. That can also be the solution. But in either case, you want to avoid the trap of being overly optimistic. I know you love your business, you're working in a startup, very inspiring, great. But here you want to be a little bit skeptical, a little bit more realistic. And the younger the firm, the more often you would want to recalculate the metric. Then the other, or the opposite pitfall, right, is the understatement of your lifespan. And this is where things get a little bit interesting, although maybe I shouldn't say that because the previous part was also supposed to be interesting. But it's very exciting, actually, because when you look at your customer base, right, you see customers who churned and customers who continue to generate revenue. And if we think in terms of statistical terms, right, you have your population, and there is a method in statistics that's called survival analysis that lets you estimate the duration of time until some event occurs. And in our case, it's churn. And so if we look at our customer base through the lens of survival analysis, we will see customers who churned, or they're left censored and their lifetime is denoted in red, or those who did not churn and whose lifetimes are denoted in blue. And the only visibility that we have are this is the present time, are the current lifetime durations, right? We don't see here, we don't see there. Since we don't see to the right of the current point in time, you can make a very easy mistake of using the current point in time as their date of churn, or ignoring them altogether. And this is a great mistake because it severely underestimates their actual lifetime durations, right? So you're dealing with this ambiguity, but you don't want to go for the Occam's razor, like, oh, you know what, the simplest explanation is that I should consider them churned as of now. No, this is not what you do. But then the question is, okay, but what do I do, right? And now we can talk solutions. And this is really, really interesting and exciting. And I wish I had this information back in the day when I was like tapping the waters of business analytics. And this is definitely great information that you can use. And it may look a little bit intimidating, especially if you haven't dealt with data, but it's pretty straightforward, trust me. So when we look at survival analysis, there are several options that it offers to model the survival function or the time to event data. And the three methods are: one is parametric, and the most common approach is Weibull. It relies on a Weibull statistical distribution, and it's used to analyze data, and it's a continuous varying probability that takes into consideration the fact that churn events do not happen at the same rate. Then there's semi-parametric. You don't see it here because it just didn't fit. And the most common approach there is Cox regression. And the differentiator for that method is that it takes into account different covariates like gender, age, your salary data point, right? So it's easier to incorporate covariates. And then we have the non-parametric method, and the most popular there is Kaplan-Meier, like top right corner. And out of the three, and I'm going to zoom in on Kaplan-Meier because that's what I use as an example for my next slide. But out of the three, Kaplan-Meier is the most flexible. It does not rely on any statistical distribution. It measures central tendency with the median. It's not as easy and straightforward to incorporate covariates as with Cox regression. It's not as smooth as Weibull, because with Weibull, with Kaplan-Meier, each drop of the survival function is an event happening for at least one client. So again, if you're a startup and you have like a smaller data pool, it can get like jumpier and less realistic. So that's like one of the downsides that you need to keep in mind. And one more is that if there are no churn events happening in the given period, then it's going to assign a probability of 1 to that period, which may not be desirable or realistic. Regardless of that, I still think it's a valuable method as long as you keep in mind those limitations. And it returns a cumulative probability of surviving past a given point in time. And trust me, when I built this algorithm, it was like the beginning of my journey with Python. If I could do it, you can do it. And there's like, I shared my GitHub, the code actually for all three survival functions in my GitHub. So you don't have, like, you'll have access to it. You'll be able to like play around with it. I also included the data set. And speaking of data set, it's very, very straightforward. And I guess like one of the reasons I didn't mention why I picked Kaplan-Meier, because it was so straightforward to use, right? Especially when you're like beginning to get into the world of like data analytics and thinking about it in terms of statistics, right? It only requires you like 3 inputs. One is your customer type, and ideally it'll be like behavioral driven. Then you have your contract age or tenure. And then you have a column like 1 or 0, whether the client has churned. That's it. And if you look at the graph itself, you will see the actual survival curve on the y-axis. You have the probability of surviving past a given point in time. Or alternatively, you can think of it as this is a proportion of my customer base that I'm expecting to survive at any given point in time, which is on the x-axis. It can be years, it can be months, right? And so at each given point in time, you can like put your cursor on the curve, and you can see like I separated cohort 1 versus the rest, right? And I can like put my cursor on one of the on the line right here and say, okay, so at this at the mark 6, or like 6 years, for example, the probability of them surviving up until then is like 80%, for example. But what the number should I use as the baseline? Is the median, and it's denoted in red, and it basically gives you an idea of this. There's like a 50% chance that my client is still alive at that point in time, right? And one thing to note: if your curve never goes below the median, or like never goes below 50%, then you're not going to see the median. Like you won't be able to calculate it. Besides seeing it on the graph, You can also print it out to your console. And of course, you need the confidence interval, which calculated behind the scenes using the standard deviation to come up with a range of values that contain 95% likelihood of having the true median value, right? And it's a really, really great and straightforward approach. There's low probability of you misinterpreting results because it's so right in your face, right? It's so obvious. But you do want to be, again, mindful of, do I have enough data to actually trust it? Can I trust it for a long time, right? Because especially when your product is evolving and you look like long-term, and you understand that you want to ask yourself a question, well, in 5 years down the line, will my product stay in its current state, or will it evolve or be disrupted, right? Or am I planning on adding additional streams of revenue in the next 2 years? Because this metric is not gonna know it, right? And it also assumes that your market and churn values, like your market and churn rate, remains the same, right? It doesn't have those inputs. So you want to be mindful, you want to recalculate, reiterate, repeat, and evaluate, because you want to think of it in terms of trend rather than one pool of data. Okay, cool. But this is all great. This is wonderful. But what if I'm not a subscription business? What if I don't have a contract? What if I don't have a definitive start and churn date, right? What if I'm Amazon or Etsy and I have customers who are like purchasing off of me at different points in time? How do I know when they churned, or like, did they churn, or are they just in between a longer stretch of transactions, right? So we need to differentiate between contractual and non-contractual business setting. And we have Ross here, and that's like my favorite show, friends. I just couldn't help it. I know we have to be like serious and all, but this is just like, they were on a break, so they didn't churn. They did not terminate. And there are some main challenges that you want to be mindful of if you're a retailer. And actually, Peter Fader, who you may have heard of, he is a professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He spoke of those challenges for the retail non-contractual business settings at length. And the first challenge that he highlights in his papers is that you do not have visibility into their purchasing rate, right? It's a non-observable purchasing rate, and it varies drastically from customer to customer. And think of it this way. You probably, let's say you buy off of Amazon for like 100 times a year, probably more, but let's say 100 times a year. And you've probably been shopping around like holidays, or Amazon is a bad example because I feel like it crept into your lives and you use it like every day. But let's say Etsy or like eBay or whatever, right? You like buy around the holiday season or your like family birthdays, but then it's followed by a period of no purchases, right? And to make it worse, the dropout propensity is also like, there's no visibility into it, and it varies drastically from customer to customer. You do not know who churned, when they churned, and there's no like definitive contract end date that you can just like point to. And lastly, the retention rate is rendered meaningless due to the sporadic nature of purchases. And instead, recency and frequency come in handy. And we're going to look at an example. Very interesting. So check it out. So we have one customer, and they made 5 purchases prior to today. And then we have another customer, number 2, who made like several purchases up until today. So a question: whose lifetime value do you think is higher? Yes. Oh, without my glasses, I can't really see. 1. Okay. No. And I loved it. It's a good guess, and that's what I would think right away. There's a higher probability that your second customer is still around, because for a customer who purchases less frequently, there is a higher probability that they are still alive without you being dependent on how recently they made a transaction. Meaning a low frequency customer can afford longer gaps between transactions. Whereas this high frequency customer, they're probably dead by now, churn. That's it, they're gone. Because their frequency of their transactions was so dense, and not seeing any recent transactions, recently, this is what happens. They probably churned. And that's a paradox that's coined by Peter Fader and Bruce Hardy. It's called increasing frequency paradox, which states that you cannot estimate lifetime value on purchase volume alone, right? This is the paradox that we need to be mindful of for like segmenting by frequency and recency. Okay, sounds like it's clear because it's a little confusing. It was still a good guess. It was my first guess too. And there is, right, it's okay. So you're like, okay, I understand the pains, I understand the challenges. How do I deal with them? How do I address them? With a contractual business model, we looked at Kaplan-Meier, we looked at Weibull, we looked at Cox regression, like those like survival methods, right, that you can use. There are Python libraries that you can use, like Lifelines. But in the retail non-contractual setting, for example, and facing the frequency recency variables and like how to address. So there is a probabilistic class called Buy Till You Die. And that class addresses those specific challenges. And there are several models that are that we can speak of in that setting. And there is Pareto and BD probability model. And I think it was Schmidtlein and co-authors who proposed it back in 1987. And then on its basis, more or less recently in 2005, Peter Fader, Bruce Hardy, and Kala Klee developed a BG and BD probability model linking customer lifetime value to the famous RFM marketing paradigm, which is frequency, recency, monetary value. There are some people who made the connection before them, but nobody formalized it, and nobody came up with an actionable solution where you can just put in those RFM variables and get the customer lifetime value as a result. And there's actually a publicly available Excel spreadsheet that will be listed under my resources, but also you can, if you Google BG and BD Bruce Hardy, like right on his website, there's a PDF, there's Excel spreadsheet that you can also try out. And again, under my resource, you'll have all of the links of what I used to come up with the presentation. So, and it's interesting, right? So there are different types of problems for different business models, and there are different types of solutions, and each of them is interesting in its own regard. Let me make sure that I didn't miss anything. I feel like I'm down like 3 papers already. I think we're good. Yes, I told you about the Excel spreadsheet. That's good. So while these are the most common models of the Buy Till You Die probabilistic class, there are still some other options built around them. And there is a publicly shared presentation deck that Roberto Madri, the data scientist of ITSI, back in 2012, he made a presentation back in 2012. I'm not sure if he's still the head of data science at ITSI, but back in the day he was, and he shared the approach that they take at ITSI in order to think about customer lifetime value. And they think of it in terms of 2 probabilities or 2 coin flips. One is the survival probability, whether the customer is still alive, aka remembers about the brand, or churns, aka forgets about the brand. And this is interesting. I don't think he shared how exactly they solve for it in terms of where they get the data about forgets and dies. I can think of, for example, users visiting their website and tracking usage on the website, maybe having cookies and tracking usage across other websites, or maybe it's like a Sense 360 type of product that lets you see the wallet share of Etsy versus competitors over time. I don't know. But let's say they nail it down, and that's the survival probability. They know that the customer either remembers about Etsy and lives, or forgets and dies. And the next one is transaction probability, or transaction coin flip that they make, is whether the customer, assuming they're alive, whether they make a purchase. And there's some math involved that he doesn't really necessarily talk about, but he'll highlight, so you can check out in the deck what exactly he used. But this is the gist. And as for segmentation, you can see that he actually used the approach that we mentioned, segmenting customers by customer behavior, like how frequently they make purchases and how recently they make them, right? So these are the base inputs, and this is how they bin their customer base. And lastly, you may ask, okay, so we talked about the lifespan so much because it's so complex. What about the actual monetary value? How do we tie it to that? Approaches there are vary as well. You can take your average contract value, multiply it by margin and your average lifespan. If you're a transaction, if you're the non-contractual business, maybe you take your number of expected future transactions discounted to yield the present value, multiplied by your average transaction value and margin, maybe in the lifespan. Maybe that's how you get it. But even then, Peter, oh, did I just forget his name? Peter, thank you. Like so many names. Peter Fader. He actually questioned against it. He said that this will not give you an accurate estimate. And ideally, you would take your customers' past purchasing and the overall population tendencies to come up with a weighted average. But like, honestly, not to get you very intimidated, I think since you calculate this metric as a trend, it's fine if you keep it simple at the beginning, as long as you're aware of the caveats and assumptions, which hopefully by the end of this talk, you are. And this is like me smoothly transitioning into saying that, not even hoping, but I think it gave you a great idea of what to be mindful of when calculating the metric, whatever option you choose, be it like Python driven, statistics driven, or like internet formula driven, right? There are some, we talked about solutions and we spoke of different methodologies. There are resources. You can also, I don't think you need to take a picture of the links. I think it's easier if you just go to my GitHub right here. And there is a repository for this presentation with resources listed. And you can always reach out to me and ask me like, where do I find anything, right? And I can guide you in that. And yeah, I'm ready for questions now or after this talk. And yes.
So we get a lot of data in commerce.
Yeah.
We don't have to wait for the customer. We know that we know which customers are engaged because we have email data, we have retargeting data, we have ad data. So we get a lot of data.
Good.
So we know high intent, and the tools will alert us high intent. Like this person is high intent. Where do we map the high intent data?
How do you define high intent?
High intent is when he's checking every email and he's coming to the site.
Okay.
We know that this customer is going to buy it.
So you,
and Amazon does the same thing.
okay, so somebody asked me for our Zoom listeners, somebody asked me like, how do you think about if you're an e-commerce business, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting the question, but like if you're e-commerce business and you get a lot of data and you can differentiate, since you're getting so many data sources, you can differentiate between who is high intent, right, quote unquote, because it's very arbitrary, right? And who is not, meaning who makes a lot of purchases and you're expecting them to, but that's how you think of it. Meaning the person who you define as a high intent is probably a high frequency customer, right?
It's not high frequency, but he's highly engaged.
He's highly engaged, but he's frequently engaged. Highly is frequent, right?
Because, yeah,
You're not thinking about in terms of depth, you're thinking in terms of.
He's getting to like he's going to go to the cart page, right? So we got product detail page, he's going to be on the PDP, he's going to go to the cart page, and then he goes to checkout.
That's right, okay.
So we call those cart abandonments.
But they don't leave the cart. They stay in the cart and make purchase.
Some of them leave the cart. So the cart abandonments,
yeah,
we want to put their data in here.
Okay, so I think we're thinking of it like in slightly different terms. If we're zooming in to see at the micro level at a customer who gets to the cart and then either churns, right, or purchases, and that's your data. You have the list of customers who made it to the cart, let's say, and then they either purchase or live, or maybe by the fact that they're getting to the cart, it's your first coin flip. It's like they live, they remember about me. Like think Etsy, like the most recent example, right?
We know that they know us because they're checking our email.
Or that's fine. Whatever, however you define it, doesn't matter. But that's how you think of it. You define a condition where somebody lives, and you calculate. Okay, so of those who live, like first of all, what's the proportion of those who live, and what's the probability?
It's more granular because cart abandonment is very. It's like they're going to be purchasing eventually. Amazon knows that, so Amazon will put that. Because if you buy from Amazon, they know that this kid's going to buy this.
Yeah.
And they'll have those goods available in the warehouse. They know that. So they actually pre-order them. So some companies will pre-order. They know that this kid's going to buy.
Well, first of all, it's another thing, right? You know your average volume of purchases. You don't need a customer lifetime value for that. You just know that this is how quickly my goods are sold out, and this is the percentage of my goods that's left after the purchase completes. That's a different thing. But in terms of lifetime value, and we can talk more if you think there are like some caveats that we need to be mindful of. We can talk after this
There's
talk.
a lot more data we gather a lot more data in CLV.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. You're thinking like, how do I use all of this data? And I think you can also think of it this way. You have your remember like Kaplan-Meier-Weibull, right, where we talked about I need to look into whether you can apply it to your non-contractual business setting, but I would think if you have those different customers and you have those different covariates, maybe you go simple first. You just narrow it down on your recency, frequency, and whether you have like 2 probabilities they live on or die, right, and whether they make a purchase or not. And you narrow it down to them. And then you separate it more further by your maybe customer location, customer, like you incorporate all of your, I know you're anxious to get all of the data in there because to make it more accurate, supposedly, right? And to make it more precise. But I think initially, especially when you're like doing it for the first time and exercise, keep it simple. Because if you keep it complex right away, it'll be hard to troubleshoot. Like think about bug, bug troubleshooting. You want to keep it simple, trace it to the most basic steps. And then once you're sure that what you're doing makes sense, then you incorporate more complexity. But this is, I think it still can apply. I think your question was not more about how do I use it, but more about how do I incorporate additional streams of data that I have to make it better, to make it more precise. That's a different type of questions, which, yeah. That's a great question. That was good engagement. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Oh, I was going to say.
Yeah. You can. You can. It depends on, like, survival analysis is just like one of the methods. I'm not saying like it's the only method, but it's one of the most straightforward methods typically used in the business setting. I mean, I shouldn't say that because what's typically used is like some basic formulas that we saw at the beginning. But when you're like, a little bit more sophisticated, then that's what you typically go to. And if if you want to compare and choose a different method, you can definitely do that. And how do I check questions on Zoom, by the way? It's very interesting, right? And I typically worked in the contractual business setting. So to me, it was interesting to see the non-contractual side of it because it's very, and I have a company that I registered. We used to sell a little bit on eBay. We're not there yet to think about customer lifetime value, but I don't think there are any questions. Is there?
No.
Okay.
No.
So yeah, find me afterwards, and we're hiring. So if you're interested, talk to me or my amazing manager who actually made it happen, Kanat Basu. We work together, and I'm not trying, to, because it's my manager, but he's really great, and he helped me get out of my comfort zone and share my knowledge with y'all. So yeah, thanks for coming. And you showed that you're curious and you want to do more and better. So absolutely. Oh, and
So I think we're on a break now. I think there's back in about an hour.